They didn't hand me the key like it was important. That's what still gets me. If someone had placed it in my palm with a solemn look, if they'd whispered, "Guard this with your life," I might have understood the weight of it. But it came to me the way people pass a receipt, absently, almost kindly, like a small favor they wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. It was the day after the funeral, when the house still smelled like lilies and old coffee and the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Everyone else moved through the rooms like they belonged there, opening cabinets, folding tablecloths, deciding what to keep and what to toss. I stood near the hallway with a paper plate of food I didn't want, feeling like a guest in my own grief. My Aunt Marlene found me there. Mascara smudged under one eye, mouth set tight with something that looked less like sadness and more like purpose. She took my wrist gently, the way adults do when they don't want to look forceful, and guided my hand open. "Here," she said. Metal touched skin. Cool, heavy for its size. A brass key on a plain ring, no tag, no label, no explanation, just a key. I stared at it like it might start talking. "What is this?" Marlene's eyes flicked past me toward the living room, where my cousins were laughing too loudly at something on TV. She lowered her voice. "Just keep it safe, okay? Don't lose it." "Safe for what?" I asked, because something in my chest didn't like the way she dodged the question. Her fingers tightened briefly on my wrist, a warning wrapped in softness. "It's yours now," she said, and then she smiled, small, practiced, the kind of smile people use to end conversations they don't want to have. "I have to check on the coffee." And she was gone, slipping back into the noise like she hadn't just changed the shape of my whole day. I stayed in the hallway with my fist closed around the key, feeling its teeth press into my palm. I wanted to believe it was a gift, something sentimental, a final message from someone who couldn't speak anymore. But the way Marlene said keep it safe didn't sound like treasure it. It sounded like hide it. That's the thing about family. They can wrap a secret in a ribbon and call it love. My mother had died quietly, the way she'd lived those last few years. Small, careful, apologizing for taking up space. She'd been the one smoothing tensions, swallowing her own needs so other people could feel comfortable. When she got sick, she did it the same way, insisting she was fine until she was. And when she finally passed, everyone arrived with casseroles and sympathy and stories that skipped the nights I sat beside her bed, listening to her breathe like every inhale was a decision. So when Marlene put that key in my hand, something bitter rose up under my grief. A part of me thought, of course, even now, even after death, there's still something everyone knows that I don't. I tried asking my Uncle Jerome when he was stacking chairs in the dining room. "Aunt Marlene gave me a key," I said, keeping my voice casual like it didn't matter. "Do you know what it goes to?" Jerome didn't pause. He didn't look up. He just slid one chair into another with a harsh scrape. "Probably your mama's old stuff," he said. "She had all kinds of things." "That's not an answer," I said. He finally glanced at me, eyes tired, not unkind, but closed. "Listen," he murmured. "Today ain't the day, just hold on to it. Hold on to it, keep it safe, don't lose it." Those were the only instructions I got, and they sat in my stomach like stones. That night after the last car pulled away and the dishes were washed, I sat on the edge of my mother's bed. Her pillow still held the faint shape of her head. I turned the key between my fingers, watching it catch the lamp light. The brass was scratched, used, familiar to someone. Not new, not ceremonial. If it was mine now, it meant someone decided I could handle it, or someone decided I was the only one who would. Either way, I knew I wasn't going to sleep until I understood what they refused to say. And in the silence of that room, with grief sitting beside me like a shadow, I realized the key wasn't the mystery. Their silence was. So I did what I'd always done when the people I loved withheld the truth. I started listening harder. In the morning, I would start asking questions quietly, patiently, relentlessly today. They never said no outright. That would have been easier, cleaner, almost merciful. Instead, every question I asked dissolved into vague answers and polite smiles, like truth was something fragile they didn't want to drop in front of me. The day after the funeral, I tried again. Over coffee that tasted burnt and sympathy that felt rehearsed, I asked my aunt what the key was for, gently, the way you ask when you're already bracing for disappointment. She stirred her cup too long before answering, watching the cream disappear. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, voice light, eyes heavy. Then she asked if I was eating enough. That was the pattern. Deflection dressed up as care. Concern used like a curtain, pulled closed whenever I got too close to the truth. I heard it everywhere. In my uncle's laugh when I asked about my mother's papers. In my cousin's sudden need to change the subject. In the way conversations lowered in volume when I entered the room. No one told me to stop asking. They just answered like I was asking the wrong questions, like the problem wasn't their silence but my curiosity. That kind of avoidance has a texture. It's soft on the surface, almost kind, but firm underneath. You feel it when you press too hard, when your fingers hit something solid that won't give. I'd felt it my whole life. I was the one trusted to babysit, to keep secrets, to handle emergencies. I was reliable, calm, the person everyone leaned on when things went wrong. But when it came to honesty, to the messy, uncomfortable truths, I was suddenly too sensitive, too young, too fragile to be included. The key fit right into that pattern. They trusted me enough to hold it, to keep it safe, to carry the weight of it without complaint. They just didn't trust me enough to tell me why. Every night, I turned it over in my hand, listening to the small sound it made against the ring. It felt louder in the dark, like it was trying to remind me that ignorance is never neutral. I thought about my mother then, about all the things she must have known and never said, about the way she protected people by protecting their secrets, even when those secrets cost her. Maybe that was what they saw in me, someone who wouldn't ask too loudly, someone who would carry the burden quietly and call it love. I wanted to believe the silence was kindness, that they were sparing me pain. But the longer they avoided the truth, the more I felt the shape of it pressing in around me. Silence doesn't erase danger. It just delays it. And every delayed answer sharpened my fear into something steadier, heavier, harder to ignore. I started watching instead of asking, listening for pauses, nodding who exchanged glances when my name came up, who stiffened when the key flashed briefly in my hand. Truth leaves fingerprints even when people try to wipe it away. Inconsistencies, half-stories, sudden urgency disguised as calm. I realized then that the key wasn't just metal. It was a test, not of loyalty, but of endurance. How long could I hold responsibility without demanding honesty? That question followed me everywhere, echoing in quiet rooms and crowded kitchens alike. And with every evaded answer, my resolve hardened. They thought silence would keep things contained. They were wrong. Silence doesn't contain truth, it ferments it. By the time the house emptied and I was alone with the key again, I knew this much. Whatever door it opened, no one was going to walk me to it. If I wanted the truth, I would have to claim it myself, without permission, without guidance, without the comfort of reassurance. And that understanding settled into me slowly, like a bruise forming under the skin. Tender, undeniable, impossible to ignore. I stopped hoping someone would explain it all. Hope, I learned, can be another way people keep you quiet. Instead, I began preparing myself for whatever waited on the other side of that door, knowing that once I opened it, there would be no unknowing what I found. Their silence had done its job. It had stripped away my innocence and replaced it with intention. And in that intention, something dangerous and necessary began to grow. I didn't know what the truth would cost me yet. I only knew I was done being protected by lies. The next step wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment of clarity. Just a quiet decision made in the middle of an ordinary morning. I would stop asking for permission to know my own life. The key rested in my pocket, heavier now with meaning, and as I closed the door behind me, I understood that silence had pushed me exactly where it never intended to. Toward the door they hoped I would never open. And with that realization, the fear shifted. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape, becoming something closer to resolve. I knew the truth would hurt. I also knew not knowing had already hurt enough. So when the time came, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't wait for approval. I wouldn't ask again. Because silence had already given me my answer. And whatever waited behind that locked door, I was finally ready to meet it. Not as the quiet one, not as the reliable one, but as someone who deserved the truth. The silence had tried to keep me small. Instead, it taught me how to listen. And listening, I was beginning to understand, is where truth always starts. All that remained was the courage to follow it. I took the key out one last time, feeling its edges, steadying my breath. Whatever door it belonged to, I would find it. And when I did, I wouldn't pretend I didn't know what I was opening. The truth had been waiting long enough. So had I. Tomorrow, I would stop listening to silence and start listening to what it was hiding. That was the moment everything began to change. Not loudly, not publicly, but irreversibly. And the key, still warm from my hand, felt less like a burden and more like a direction. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew I was done being led away from the truth. And that was enough to take the next step, even if I had to take it alone. Especially if I had to take it alone. Because truth rarely comes with company. Anyway, I told myself I was just going to check. That was the lie I used to make it feel safer. Not open, not confront, not expose, just check. As if curiosity could be neutral. As if wanting to know was somehow less dangerous than knowing. The key sat in my pocket all morning, heavy enough to pull my thoughts downward. Every sound in the house felt amplified, like the walls themselves were listening, waiting to see if I would obey the silence everyone else had chosen. I moved carefully, quietly, the way you do when you're not sure whether you're allowed to be somewhere or not. The door was at the end of the hallway I'd passed 100 times growing up. Always closed, always locked. I'd never asked about it before because children learn early which questions tighten a room. I remembered my mother brushing past it without looking, her hand tightening on mine whenever we walked by. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Now, standing there, it felt like everything. I stood with my hand on the knob longer than I care to admit. Obedience has a strong pull when it's been trained into you. There was a voice in my head that sounded like my family, like love disguised as caution. Leave it alone. Some things aren't yours. Don't make trouble. Another voice, quieter, steadier, answered back. You already have the key. That was the moment I understood the risk wasn't opening the door. The risk had been living all this time without knowing why it existed. The lock resisted at first, stiff from years of disuse. When it finally turned, the sound was louder than I expected, a sharp click that felt like it echoed through my chest. I held my breath, waiting for someone to call my name, to stop me, to give me one last chance to turn back. No one did. The door opened onto a narrow room with no windows. The air smelled old, dry, untouched. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting shadows that made the space feel smaller than it was. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with boxes and folders, everything labeled in my mother's careful handwriting. My name appeared more than once. That was the first thing that made my stomach drop. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not because I needed to, but because something in me knew this wasn't a discovery meant for witnesses. I picked up the nearest box, my hands trembling despite my efforts to steady them. Inside were documents, bank statements, property records, letters folded and refolded until the creases softened. Dates stretched back years, overlapping moments I remembered clearly, birthdays, hospital stays, holidays where everyone smiled too much. I sat on the floor as realization settled in slowly, cruelly. Money had been moved. Accounts opened in my name without my knowledge, then drained. Decisions made for my benefit that somehow never benefited me at all. Neglect doesn't leave paper trails. Planning does. I found a letter addressed to my mother, unsigned but unmistakably familiar in tone. It spoke of responsibility, of sacrifice, of doing what was necessary to keep the peace. It thanked her for handling things quietly, for keeping me calm, for trusting that I wouldn't need to know. My hands shook harder then. What once felt like protection now revealed itself as strategy. The silence wasn't kindness, it was containment. I kept reading, each page stripping away another layer of the story I'd been told about my own life. Opportunities rerouted, assets reassigned, futures discussed like inventory. My role reduced to something manageable, something pliable. I realized with a sick clarity that the door had never been locked to keep danger out. It was locked to keep me out. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no single document that screamed villainy. It was worse than that. It was systematic, thoughtful, done by people who hugged me, who told me they loved me, who trusted me with keys but not with truth. I pressed my back against the wall and laughed once, sharp and hollow. All those years I'd blamed myself for feeling left behind, for not quite fitting into the future everyone else seemed to be moving toward. I thought I wasn't trying hard enough, that I was missing something. I was. They had made sure of it. The door reframed everything. My mother's quiet exhaustion, my family's insistence that I be patient. The way responsibility always came without authority. I wasn't overlooked. I was managed. That understanding cut deeper than anger. It rewrote my grief into something colder, heavier. My mother hadn't just kept secrets. She'd been enlisted, and whether she agreed or felt trapped, I would never fully know. I gathered the documents into my lap, the weight of them grounding me in a truth I couldn't unsee. Safety, I realized, is often just the absence of questions. Risk begins the moment you start asking why. I stayed in that room longer than I meant to, reading until the flickering light made my eyes ache. When I finally stood, I felt different. Not braver, not stronger, just clearer. As I locked the door again, slipping the key back into my pocket, I understood something else they hadn't anticipated. Once you open a door like that, you don't go back to obedience. You go forward into consequence. Before I left the room, I noticed a smaller box tucked behind the others, unmarked. Inside were photographs I'd never seen before, candid shots, meetings I wasn't invited to. My mother seated at tables with people who looked all business, all urgency. In every photo, her shoulders were tense, her smile absent. She looked like someone carrying weight she couldn't put down. I understood then that obedience had been demanded of her too. Curiosity punished. Silence rewarded. Love measured by how little disruption you caused. That knowledge complicated my anger. It didn't erase it, but it sharpened it, aimed it more carefully. This wasn't just about money or paperwork or even betrayal. It was about a system that decided who got to know and who got to cope. I replaced everything exactly as I found it. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my panic. When I stepped back into the hallway, the house looked the same as it always had, polite, familiar, deceptively calm. I paused, listening. Laughter drifted in from the kitchen. Someone called my name, asking if I wanted tea. The normalcy felt obscene, like a performance staged inches away from the truth. "I'll be there in a minute," I called back, my voice steady enough to convince even myself. As I walked away, the contrast settled into place. Obedience had kept me safe but small. Curiosity had made me vulnerable but real. The risk wasn't that I'd open the door. The risk was that they would realize I had. I knew then that secrecy doesn't end when truth is found. It adapts, it resists, and it punishes those who refuse to stay contained. The door wasn't meant to be opened because it changed the balance. Knowledge always does. I slipped the key deeper into my pocket, anticipating the conversations ahead, the denials, the smiles that would no longer fool me. Whatever came next would demand more than quiet endurance. It would demand a choice. And I was done, pretending not to see the doors they'd built around me. After I closed the door, I didn't rush to confront anyone. I didn't slam drawers or demand explanations. I did something quieter and in some ways more devastating. I started remembering. Memory is dangerous once truth gives it a new lens. It stops being nostalgia and starts becoming evidence. I sat alone that night, the house dim and ordinary, and replayed moments I'd carried for years like soft truths. Conversations that had once felt gentle now revealed their edges. Advice that sounded loving now felt strategic. The lie wasn't one sentence or one moment. It was a pattern, woven carefully enough that I mistook it for care. I remembered being told, again and again, "You don't need to worry about that." It had always sounded reassuring, like protection. Now I heard the second meaning beneath it: "You're not meant to know." When my friends talked about plans and opportunities, I'd smile and say I was taking my time. When relatives praised my patience, my maturity, I absorbed it like a compliment. I thought being low maintenance meant being strong. I didn't realize it also meant being easy to manage. The lie worked because it wasn't cruel. Cruelty raises alarms. This was softer, slower, wrapped in affection. It was hugs paired with omissions, smiles paired with redirections, love paired with locked doors. I remembered my mother sitting at the kitchen table late at night, papers spread out before her, rubbing her temples like she was trying to erase a headache that wouldn't leave. When I asked if she was okay, she'd look up quickly and smile too fast. "Just tired," she'd say. "Go to bed." At the time, I believed her. I remembered relatives insisting decisions were already handled whenever I showed interest. I remembered being praised for not asking questions, for being adaptable, for trusting the family. Innocence was rewarded. Curiosity quietly discouraged. The more I revisited these moments, the clearer the shape of manipulation became. Not manipulation born of malice, but of convenience. It's easier to move pieces on a board when one of them doesn't realize there's a game. What hurt most wasn't the loss of money or opportunity. It was the realization that my trust had been an asset to them, something they counted on, something they relied on staying intact. I had always thought betrayal required intent, that someone had to mean harm for it to count. But sitting with these memories, I understood something else. Harm can be done by people who tell themselves they're being kind. The lie made sense because it was designed to. It fit perfectly into the person I was encouraged to be: calm, grateful, undemanding, someone who accepted explanations without insisting on clarity. I remembered the times I felt left behind and blamed myself. The nights I wondered why things seemed harder for me, slower, narrower. I told myself I was imagining it, that comparison was unhealthy, that everyone had their own path. Those thoughts hadn't come from nowhere. They'd been planted, nurtured, reinforced. I wasn't just kept from the truth. I was taught to doubt my instincts. That realization settled in my chest like a quiet rage. Not explosive, not dramatic, just steady and hot and exhausting. The kind that doesn't scream, but doesn't leave either. I thought about how often I'd defended them to myself. How many times I'd softened my own disappointment because I didn't want to believe anyone I loved could choose secrecy over honesty. I had confused familiarity with integrity. Looking back, the signs were there. The way conversations stopped when I entered the room. The way plans were finalized without me. The way responsibility always flowed downward, while information flowed sideways, around me, never through me. Innocence, I learned, is easy to preserve when you're willing to sacrifice someone else's agency. The lie also explained why the key came to me without explanation. They knew I would hold it. They knew I wouldn't rush to use it. They counted on my obedience long outlasting my curiosity. That was the real miscalculation. Because once the lie cracked, everything rushed in at once. Grief for the years I'd spent adapting to limitations I never chose. Anger at how smoothly they'd rehearsed concern. And sadness for my mother, who had lived inside that same lie, convincing herself silence was love. I imagined her being told the same things I'd been told, that it was better this way, that knowing would only complicate things, that protection sometimes required omission. The lie didn't just shape my past, it shaped hers too. That understanding softened some of my anger, but it sharpened my resolve. I could hold compassion without surrendering clarity. I could acknowledge her position without excusing theirs. The betrayal deepened not because the truth was hidden, but because it was hidden from me specifically. Because they decided, over and over, that I was strong enough to bear responsibility but not worthy of honesty. That distinction mattered. I thought of all the times I'd been told I was so understanding, How often that word had been used to end conversations instead of open them. Understanding, I realized, had been code for compliance. By the time the night stretched thin and quiet, I wasn't questioning myself anymore. The confusion that had followed me for years finally had a shape, a source, a name. It wasn't failure. It was design. The lie made sense too late because it was meant to. It was built to age well, to survive years without scrutiny, to collapse only when someone stopped playing their assigned role. And now that it had collapsed, there was no way to rebuild it the same way. I felt a strange solidarity with anyone who has ever looked back at their life and realized the rules were never what they were told. Anyone who has had to grieve not just what happened, but what could have happened if honesty had been offered sooner. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern I could finally see clearly. The anger didn't push me toward revenge. It pushed me toward precision, toward choosing what I would accept going forward and what I would not. Because innocence lost too late doesn't turn into bitterness by default. Sometimes it turns into awareness. And awareness, once earned, is difficult to take away. I folded those memories carefully, like evidence, and set them aside. I wasn't ready to confront anyone yet, but I was done doubting myself. The lie had made sense for years. It would not survive the truth. Not now. Not anymore. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand why the key had landed in my hand and not anyone else. At first, I clung to the idea that it meant something good, that it was proof of trust, of closeness, of a special role I didn't fully see yet. People want meaning before they want truth. Meaning feels kinder. But truth has a way of repeating itself until you stop ignoring it. Once I stopped romanticizing the gesture, the answer became painfully clear. I wasn't chosen because I was valued. I was chosen because I was useful. Usefulness is a quiet currency in families like mine. It doesn't come with praise or recognition. It comes with expectations. You're the one who stays calm when everyone else panics. You're the one who shows up without being asked. You're the one who doesn't make scenes, doesn't demand explanations, doesn't crumble when things get heavy. You're the one people lean on, without ever asking how much weight you can actually carry. That had always been me. I was reliable in the way that makes people comfortable taking things for granted. If something needed handling discreetly, I handled it. If someone needed space from responsibility, I filled the gap. I didn't complain. I didn't resist. I told myself that being needed was the same as being important. The key fit neatly into that role. They didn't give it to the loudest person, or the most confrontational, or the one most likely to ask questions. They gave it to the person least likely to disrupt the system by asking why it existed at all. They gave it to me because I knew how to hold things without breaking. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, scattered across small interactions I'd once overlooked. The way my aunt spoke to me with relief instead of warmth. The way my uncle emphasized how much he appreciated my maturity whenever something uncomfortable came up. Appreciation without authority. Gratitude without transparency. I saw it clearly then. They trusted me with responsibility because they didn't have to respect me to do it. Respect would have required explanation. Respect would have required consent. Responsibility, on the other hand, could simply be assigned. The key wasn't a symbol of inclusion. It was a contingency plan. If something went wrong, I would already be holding it. If questions arose, I could be managed. If blame needed to land somewhere, it wouldn't fall upward. I had been chosen not as an equal, but as a buffer. That understanding shifted something fundamental inside me. The story stopped being about secrecy and became about ethics, about the quiet ways people justify burdening others while telling themselves they're doing the right thing. I thought about how often I'd been told I was strong, how rarely anyone had asked if I wanted to be. Strength, I realized, is often something people assign you so they don't have to examine their own choices. The key demanded strength without offering protection. It demanded responsibility without granting authority. It demanded silence without guaranteeing safety. an insurance policy disguised as trust. I replayed the moment it was handed to me. The casual tone, the lack of explanation, the urgency wrapped in indifference. It hadn't been an emotional handoff, it had been a logistical one. Here, you'll handle this. And I had, without realizing what handling it truly meant. That's the cruel trick of usefulness. It convinces you that endurance is virtue and that asking for clarity is weakness. It trains you to accept weight as proof of worth. But value is different. Value invites honesty. Value comes with context. Value says, "This is heavy, do you want to carry it?" Responsibility without respect says, "You'll manage." I saw now how carefully they'd maintained that imbalance, how praise replaced transparency, how my reliability had been quietly weaponized against me. I wasn't trusted because I was respected. I was trusted because I was predictable. That realization hurt more than the documents, more than the money, more than the locked door, because it forced me to confront how long I'd participated in my own diminishment. I had learned to equate silence with loyalty, to equate compliance with love, to equate endurance with moral goodness. The key exposed that lie too. I understood then why no one followed up with me, why no one asked how I was doing with it, why no one checked in to see if I had questions. They weren't worried about me opening the door. They were worried about me not holding it steady. I thought about my mother again, about how she must have been chosen for the same reasons. Calm, capable, unlikely to rebel, useful. I wondered how many times she'd told herself she was protecting me by staying quiet. How many times she'd accepted responsibility without respect because it felt easier than confrontation. That knowledge complicated my grief, but it also clarified my anger. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, one that relied on certain people being strong enough to carry what others didn't want to face. The moral reckoning came quietly, not as outrage, but as clarity. I didn't need to villainize them to understand what they'd done. I didn't need to justify my pain to claim its legitimacy. I could see the system clearly now, and seeing it stripped it of its power. I had been chosen to hold the key because I had been trained to hold things. But training is not destiny. Once I recognized the exchange for what it was, usefulness traded for silence, I could choose differently. I could decide what responsibility I would accept and what I would refuse. The key no longer felt like a burden placed on me. It felt like evidence, proof of how easily people confuse dependability with disposability. I understood something else then, too. Being useful is not the same as being valued, but it can feel like it for a long time if no one teaches you the difference. They had relied on that confusion. I slipped the key back into my pocket with intention this time. Not as a keeper, not as a caretaker, but as someone who finally understood the terms of the arrangement. I wasn't angry in the way I expected to be. I was resolved. Resolved to stop carrying weight just because I could. Resolved to stop accepting responsibility without respect. Resolved to stop mistaking endurance for virtue. The mystery was gone now. What remained was a choice. And for the first time, the key didn't represent obligation. It represented leverage. Not over them. Over myself. I didn't know yet how I would use it, or if I would at all. But I knew this much with absolute certainty. I would never again confuse being chosen with being valued. And I would never again accept a role that required my silence as payment. That understanding didn't end the story, but it changed its direction. From mystery to morality. From confusion to clarity. From usefulness to worth. And once that shift happens, there is no going back to who you were before. Not when you finally know why you were chosen to hold it. I didn't plan the confrontation. That's important. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine dramatic reveals. I simply reached a point where holding the key felt heavier than the truth it guarded, and I wanted it out of my hands. Returning it seemed reasonable, clean, almost generous, a way of undoing a role I never agreed to play. I chose a quiet afternoon, when the house was full enough to feel normal but not crowded enough to feel volatile. Normal has always been their favorite disguise. I found my aunt in the kitchen, wiping a counter that was already clean, her movements precise, repetitive. I waited until she noticed me. "I don't want this anymore," I said, placing the key between us. She froze, not startled, calculating. Her eyes dropped to the counter, then lifted back to mine with practiced calm. "What are you talking about?" "The key," I said. "I know what it's for." A pause stretched between us, thin and fragile. Then she laughed lightly, as if I'd made a joke that didn't quite land. "You're reading too much into things," she said. "It's just something your mother kept. You're upset. This isn't the time." There it was, the soft dismissal, the framing of truth as emotion, of clarity as instability. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm informed." That was when her tone shifted. Not sharp, not angry, concerned, the kind of concern that shrinks you if you accept it. "You've been through a lot," she said gently. "Grief does strange things. You don't need to carry all this." I realized then that returning the key wasn't an option they'd prepared for. Obedience, yes. Silence, yes. But refusal, that disrupted the balance. "I'm not carrying it," I said. "That's why I'm giving it back." She pushed it toward me without touching it. "There's nothing to give back." The denial was smooth, almost impressive. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her. That was the most painful part. How easily the lie slid into place. How practiced it was. I tried again, this time with my uncle, later that evening. I was careful with my words, intentional. I asked about the documents. The room went quiet, like sound itself had decided to step back. He sighed, long and theatrical. "You weren't supposed to see all that." There it was, not denial, just enough truth to reassert control. "So you knew," I said. He nodded, as if indulging me. "We were trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "My own life." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're taking this personally." Gaslighting doesn't always come as aggression. Sometimes it arrives as reason, as tone, as implication that you've misunderstood something obvious. "This wasn't done to hurt you," he continued. "You were never meant to be involved." Involved, as if my existence was incidental. "I already am," I said. "You made sure of that." He shook his head, disappointed, like I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You've always been dramatic." I almost laughed. The irony was unbearable. Years of silence mistaken for drama the moment I spoke. The conversation ended the way all of them did, with no answers, with concern weaponized into dismissal, with the implication that I was the problem for refusing to accept what I'd been given. I tried once more, with my cousin, hopping proximity and age might mean honesty. Instead, I got deflection wrapped in apology. "I didn't know all the details," she said quickly. "And anyway, it's not really our business." My business, reduced to gossip, to inconvenience. Each attempt to return the key ended the same way. No one took it. No one accepted responsibility for what it represented. They all insisted I keep it, as if possession itself was the solution. That's when I understood the truth I'd been circling since the beginning. The key was never meant to be returned. It wasn't a symbol of trust. It was a mechanism of containment. As long as I held it, the burden stayed with me. The risk stayed localized. The truth stayed quiet. Returning it would have forced them to acknowledge what they'd done. They weren't prepared to do that. The tension crept in slowly, like a draft through a closed house. Conversations shortened. Invitations softened. Then disappeared. I became something fragile in their eyes, something unpredictable, dangerous. I watched relationships fracture not because I demanded justice, but because I refused to pretend ignorance was peace. They framed me as difficult, emotional, unreasonable. They told themselves they were being patient, understanding, forgiving. They never once asked why I needed forgiveness. The courage wasn't in confronting them. That part was easier than I expected. The courage was in recognizing the gaslighting for what it was and not shrinking to accommodate it. Every denial clarified the line being drawn. Not between right and wrong, but between truth and comfort. They chose comfort. By the time I stopped trying to give the key back, I felt strangely calm. The confrontation hadn't resolved anything, but it had stripped away the last illusion I was holding onto. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a refusal. And that refusal cost us something. Trust eroded. Affection cooled. Familiar warmth gave way to politeness edged with caution. I was no longer the reliable one. I was the risk. The key sat heavy in my pocket, unchanged, but I was different now. I had offered them an exit, a chance to share the weight. They had declined. That choice mattered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand restitution. All I did was ask for acknowledgement. They couldn't give it. When I finally stopped trying, it wasn't defeat. It was acceptance, not of their version of events, but of their limitations. The key remained with me not because I wanted it, but because they needed it too. And that told me everything I needed to know about what came next. Some doors aren't guarded by locks. They're guarded by denial. And once you see that clearly, the confrontation is already over. The rest is just fallout. No one warns you that integrity can be lonely. They talk about truth like it's liberating, like it lifts you into fresh air and clarity. What they don't tell you is how quiet it gets afterward. How empty rooms feel when the people who once filled them decide you've become too complicated to keep close. The cost didn't arrive all at once. It came in small withdrawals, missed calls, shorter conversations, invitations that stopped coming without explanation. Loyalty didn't break dramatically, it thinned like fabric worn down by constant friction. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe that love was sturdier than discomfort. But discomfort has a way of exposing what love is built on. When honesty enters a room and people leave, you learn quickly where you stand. The hardest part wasn't being excluded. It was watching how easily the story shifted. I became the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the person who couldn't let things go. All because I refused to carry silence as proof of loyalty. I lost people I thought would stand beside me. Some drifted quietly, avoiding conflict. Others stayed close but changed shape, their affection conditional, cautious, measured. Every interaction felt like I was being assessed, weighed against the inconvenience of my truth. There were nights I wondered if I should have kept the door closed, if knowing was worth this kind of isolation. That doubt crept in when the house was quiet and grief pressed in without distraction. Silence, I learned, sounds different when it's chosen by others. I grieved more than relationships. I grieved the version of family I believed I had. The one where love meant honesty and care meant protection for everyone, not just those with power. Letting go of that illusion hurt in a way that felt almost physical. The key became a reminder of everything I couldn't unknow. I carried it like a weight in my chest, not because of what it unlocked, but because of what it closed off. Conversations that would never happen, apologies that would never come, a future that had to be rewritten. I felt guilty for knowing, guilty for seeing my mother differently now, not as just quiet and tired, but as someone trapped between obedience and fear. Guilty for being angry at people who believed they were doing the right thing. Guilt layered itself over grief until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. There was anger, too. Anger at being forced into this position, at being made the keeper of truth without consent, at losing the comfort of ignorance without gaining support in exchange. Anger that had nowhere to go without burning bridges I wasn't sure I was ready to lose. Loyalty pulled at me from all sides. I was taught that loyalty meant staying quiet, staying close, staying agreeable. That protecting others mattered more than protecting myself. But every time I considered going back to silence, something inside me recoiled. Self-betrayal has a distinct feeling. It's subtle but unmistakable, like a dull ache that grows sharper the longer you ignore it. I had lived with that ache before without numbing it. I wasn't willing to return to it now. The cost of the key was learning that loyalty without truth is not loyalty at all. It's compliance. And compliance asks you to disappear slowly, politely, until no one remembers who you were before you started making yourself smaller. I spent weeks moving through life carefully, unsure how much of myself was still welcome anywhere. I spoke less. I listened more. Not because I agreed, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining, tired of defending, tired of being framed as the problem for refusing to pretend. Isolation has a way of clarifying priorities. With fewer voices around me, I could finally hear my own. It told me things I'd avoided for years. That peace built on silence is fragile. That belonging shouldn't require self-erasure. That love should not feel like a transaction where honesty is the price you pay to stay included. Still, knowing that didn't make the loss easier. There were moments I missed the comfort of familiarity, even when it came at a cost. Moments I longed for the ease of being liked, of not disrupting the balance. Integrity doesn't replace companionship overnight. I mourned the relationships as they were, even as I recognized they couldn't survive the truth unchanged. Mourning doesn't require regret. It only requires honesty about what was lost. The fear lingered too. Fear of becoming the family cautionary tale. Fear of being alone longer than I could bear. Fear that choosing myself meant choosing isolation permanently. Those fears whispered late at night, when resolve thins and doubt feels persuasive. But every time I imagined letting go of the truth to regain closeness, I felt something tighten inside me. The same tightening I'd felt before I opened the door. The same warning I'd ignored for too long. The key had cost me comfort. It had cost me certainty. It had cost me relationships that depended on my silence to survive. But it had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing. Self-respect. Not the loud kind, not pride or defiance. The quiet kind that lets you sleep at night without rehearsing apologies for things that weren't wrong. The kind that steadies you when you're tempted to shrink just to make others feel better. I began to understand that loss and self-respect often arrive together. That choosing integrity doesn't mean you won't grieve. It means you'll grieve honestly, without pretending the loss didn't matter. The anger softened over time, not into forgiveness, but into clarity. I didn't need to hate anyone to hold them accountable in my own life. I didn't need validation to trust my experience. I didn't need permission to move forward. The cost remained, but it stopped feeling like punishment. It felt like consequence, and consequence, unlike punishment, has meaning. Some days were still heavy. Some moments still hurt unexpectedly. But the ache of loneliness was no longer sharper than the ache of self-betrayal would have been. I realized then that the key hadn't taken these things from me. It had revealed what they were already costing me. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. You can only decide what you're willing to pay going forward. I kept the key, not because I wanted to, but because it had become part of my story. Proof of what integrity demands and what it protects. Proof that loyalty to others should never come at the expense of loyalty to yourself. The cost was real, the grief was real, the isolation was real. So was the growth. So was the strength that came from choosing myself, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Because some prices are too high to keep paying. And this one finally was. For a long time, everyone assumed they knew what I would do next. That was the quiet confidence beneath their concern, their avoidance, their careful distance. They believed I would eventually soften, that I would tire of the tension, that I would decide peace was worth more than truth, and slip back into the role that had always made things easier for everyone else. I almost did. Fear is persuasive when it dresses itself as practicality. It tells you that survival means adaptation, that endurance is the same as strength, that silence is sometimes wisdom. I had lived by those rules before. I knew how to disappear politely, how to make myself small enough to fit into expectations that were never designed for my comfort. But something had changed. The key no longer felt like an obligation. It felt like a question. What are you going to do now that you know? That question followed me everywhere, into quiet mornings, into restless nights, into conversations that hovered just above honesty but never crossed into it. The truth had cracked the surface of my life, and I could either patch it over or let it break open fully. Everyone expected me to patch it. They expected fear to win, fear of conflict, fear of isolation, fear of becoming the problem instead of the solution. Fear had always been the leverage. But fear only works when you believe you have no alternatives. The unexpected choice didn't arrive with certainty or confidence. It arrived with clarity, a small, steady understanding that I could no longer survive by shrinking. That survival built on silence was just a slower kind of erasure. I stopped trying to return the key. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided what the truth should look like. And I stopped pretending my only options were obedience or exile. Instead, I chose something quieter and far more disruptive. I chose agency. Agency doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply shifts the center of gravity. I stopped asking what would keep others comfortable and started asking what would allow me to live without flinching. That meant speaking, but not the way they expected. I didn't expose documents or make accusations. I didn't gather allies or stage confrontations. I did something they hadn't prepared for. I changed how I showed up. I spoke plainly when asked direct questions. I stopped smoothing over discomfort with humor or reassurance. When someone minimized what happened, I didn't argue. I named it and let the silence sit where it belonged. That's not how I experienced it, I would say, or I don't agree, or simply I'm not willing to do that anymore. Those sentences were small, but they carried weight. They disrupted the old rhythm. They removed the safety net of my compliance. Some people reacted with irritation, others with disbelief. A few tried harder to pull me back into familiar patterns, offering warmth and concern laced with expectation. I didn't bite. The key stayed in my possession, but it stopped defining me. I no longer saw it as something I was burdened with. I saw it as evidence of a system I refused to uphold. I decided what it meant. Sometimes that decision looked like distance, creating space where there had once been obligation, declining roles that required silence as payment, letting go of responsibilities that were never paired with respect. Other times it looked like voice, calm, measured, unapologetic, not raised, not defensive, just present. I spoke when it mattered, not to convince but to clarify, not to punish but to name reality. The fear didn't disappear. It changed shape. Instead of fear of loss, it became fear of regression. Fear of going back to a version of myself that accepted less than honesty because it was easier. That fear worked for me now. It kept me anchored. What surprised me most was how the power dynamic shifted without me doing anything dramatic. When I stopped managing their comfort, they had to manage their own reactions. Some stepped up, most didn't. And that told me everything. The choice no one expected wasn't rebellion. It was refusal. Refusal to continue absorbing the consequences of decisions I didn't make. Refusal to confuse silence with peace. Refusal to let fear dictate my future. I didn't cut everyone off. I didn't forgive everyone either. I let relationships find their natural distance based on what they could withstand. Some couldn't withstand honesty at all. Others surprised me. But the most important relationship, the one with myself, began to stabilize. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I trusted my clarity. I allowed myself to take up space without apology. The key became lighter then, not because its history changed, but because my grip did. I wasn't holding it tightly anymore. I wasn't afraid of what it represented. It was no longer leverage over me. It was context. I realized that breaking cycles doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like opting out of roles that depend on your silence. Sometimes it looks like redefining responsibility so it includes consent. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself quietly, consistently, without spectacle. That choice didn't make life easier overnight. It made it honest, and honesty has its own kind of strength. Survival had taught me how to endure. Agency taught me how to live. I began making decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. I prioritized alignment over approval. I allowed myself to disappoint people who had benefited from my compliance. The guilt still surfaced now and then, but it no longer controlled me. I recognized it as a leftover emotion from a system that trained me to measure my worth by how little trouble I caused. I caused some trouble now. Not recklessly, not cruelly, but inevitably. And I accepted that. The key didn't dictate my actions anymore. It didn't symbolize responsibility or secrecy or burden. It symbolized a moment in my life when fear stopped being my primary language. I kept it not as a reminder of what was taken from me, but of what I chose. The choice no one expected me to make wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. It didn't resolve everything neatly. But it was mine. And that made all the difference. Because once you choose agency over fear, silence over voice becomes impossible. You don't unlearn that. You don't unknow that. You don't go back. The key rested in my pocket, inert, ordinary. Its power dissolved the moment I stopped believing it had any. I had made my choice. And for the first time, the future felt open, not because someone handed me access, but because I claimed it. Whatever doors remained, I would decide which ones to open and which ones to leave behind. On my terms. I thought closure would feel like relief, like a deep breath after holding one too long. I imagined a moment where everything finally settled, where the weight lifted and I could move on without looking back. What I learned instead is that closure isn't an event. It's a decision, and it doesn't arrive quietly unless you invite it to. For a while, I confused closure with revenge. Not the dramatic kind, no fantasies of exposure or punishment, but the subtle satisfaction of being proven right. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted someone to say, "You didn't imagine it. You were wronged." I told myself that hearing those words would be enough. But waiting for validation kept me tethered to the very system I was trying to leave. Power, I realized, had been defined for me my entire life as leverage over others. Control, influence, the ability to make people respond. I had seen how that kind of power corrupted even the people who claimed to use it gently. I didn't want it anymore. So I chose something different. I chose clarity. Clarity didn't require agreement. It didn't ask for apologies. It didn't demand accountability from people unwilling to offer it. Clarity simply stated the truth and let it stand on its own. I stopped explaining. I stopped revisiting the past in conversations that were never meant to resolve anything. I stopped hoping that if I framed my pain carefully enough, someone would finally hear it the way I needed them to. Instead, I set boundaries, not as ultimatums, not as punishments, but as facts. I decided what I would discuss and what I wouldn't. I decided how close I could be without losing myself. I decided which relationships could continue and which ones had reached their natural end. That decision didn't come with applause. Some people interpreted it as coldness, others as arrogance. A few tried to provoke a reaction, mistaking restraint for weakness. I didn't correct them. Peace, I learned, doesn't need to be understood to be effective. The door became symbolic again, not the one at the end of the hallway, but the invisible ones between me and everyone else. Doors I could close without slamming. Doors I could lock without announcing. Doors I could walk away from without looking back. I returned to the room one last time, not because I needed proof anymore, but because I wanted to end the story where it began. The documents stayed where they were. The photographs remained untouched. I wasn't there to gather evidence or rehearse grievances. I was there to say goodbye. I stood in the doorway longer than I expected, noticing how ordinary it all looked now. The fear that once lived here had lost its edge. The secrets had no power without my silence to sustain them. I closed the door gently. I locked it. And then I did something that surprised even me. I left the key inside. That choice wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about absolution or reconciliation. It was about refusing to carry something that no longer belonged to me. Leaving the key behind felt like setting down a weight I'd grown used to carrying. Not because it was mine, but because no one else would pick it up. I understood then that closure doesn't come from holding on until you're acknowledged. It comes from letting go without permission. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't gather anyone to witness it. Closure didn't need an audience. It needed honesty. The pain didn't vanish. I won't pretend it did. Loss doesn't dissolve just because you choose peace. Grief still surfaced unexpectedly. So did anger now and then. But those emotions no longer dictated my direction. They visited, they didn't stay. Power, redefined, looked nothing like dominance. It looked like calm, like discernment, like the ability to walk away without needing the last word. I stopped checking to see who noticed the distance. I stopped measuring my worth by who reached out and who didn't. I stopped revisiting conversations in my head, trying to imagine how they could have gone differently. I accepted what was. That acceptance wasn't passive. It was intentional. It required discipline. It required me to resist the urge to reopen doors out of habit or guilt or longing. Some relationships faded into something quieter, more distant, but tolerable. Others ended completely. A few found a new shape, one built on honesty rather than expectation. I didn't force outcomes. I allowed them. Peace arrived slowly, not as relief, but as steadiness. A sense that I was no longer bracing for impact, that I could move forward without carrying someone else's unfinished business. I understood then that choosing peace doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've decided not to let conflict define you. Revenge would have kept me entangled. Closure set me free. I didn't need to be right out loud. I needed to be whole. The door stayed closed after that, not because I feared what was behind it, but because it no longer mattered. The story it held had already taught me what I needed to know. I didn't erase the past. I integrated it. I didn't rewrite the narrative to make everyone look better. I simply stopped participating in versions of the story that required my silence. On my terms, closure looked like boundaries. It looked like choosing not to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding. It looked like trusting my own clarity even when it wasn't echoed back. It looked like peace that didn't depend on anyone else's behavior. That kind of peace is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just exists, steady and sufficient. I walked away from the door knowing it would remain where it was, unchanged. The difference was that it no longer defined me. I defined myself. And that finally felt like power. Not the power to control outcomes, but the power to choose my ending. On my terms. For a long time, I thought the story ended with the door, with closing it, locking it, leaving the key behind. That felt like the final act, the clean conclusion. But endings are rarely where meaning lives. Meaning arrives afterward, quietly, when you realize what changed inside you while you weren't paying attention. The truth is, the key never really opened a door. It opened me. I see that now, with distance, with calm, with the kind of clarity that only comes after you stop fighting for explanations and start listening to what your life is already telling you. The key didn't give me access to secrets as much as it gave me access to myself, to instincts I'd been taught to ignore, to questions I'd been trained not to ask, to a voice that had been there all along, waiting for permission I no longer needed. For years, I thought strength meant endurance. I thought being good meant being quiet. I thought love meant carrying weight without complaint. The key dismantled those beliefs slowly, painfully, and permanently. What it opened was awareness. Awareness of how often people confuse reliability with consent. Awareness of how easily silence is mistaken for peace. Awareness of how systems, families, institutions, relationships depend on certain people staying manageable to function smoothly. Awareness is a burden at first. It isolates you. It complicates relationships. It forces you to grieve not just what happened, but what you believed. But awareness also transforms. It sharpens discernment. It clarifies boundaries. It makes choice possible. The key also opened autonomy. Not independence in the dramatic sense, but autonomy in the quiet, everyday ways that matter most. The freedom to say no without justifying it. The freedom to disengage without apologizing. the freedom to define responsibility on your own terms. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to others. I stopped confusing being needed with being valued. I stopped accepting roles that required my silence as payment. That shift didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the most sustainable form of courage. The key opened self-worth too. Not the kind built on achievement or approval, but the kind that comes from alignment. From knowing that even if no one else validates your experience, it still counts. From trusting your perception without waiting for consensus. Self-worth doesn't shout, it steadies. When I look back now, I don't see a story about betrayal as much as I see a story about transition. About moving from someone who survived by adapting to someone who lives by choosing. About outgrowing the version of yourself that made sense in a smaller world. The door was never the point. The point was realizing I had always been capable of opening more than I was told. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, it's probably because you've been handed a key too. Maybe not a literal one. Maybe it came as responsibility without authority, or trust without transparency, or praise that kept you compliant instead of informed. Maybe you were chosen because you were strong, or quiet, or dependable, or unlikely to push back. Maybe you were told it was love. I won't tell you what to do with your key. That's the whole point. Agency can't be prescribed. But I will tell you this, if holding it feels heavy, it's worth asking why. If keeping it requires silence, it's worth questioning what that silence protects. If you've been told not to open certain doors for your own good, it's worth wondering whose good that really serves. Some keys are given as gifts. Others are given as tests. And some are given as burdens, disguised as trust. What matters isn't how you got it. What matters is what you decide it means. For me, it means I no longer confuse access with permission. I no longer wait to be deemed ready for truth. I no longer outsource my understanding of my own life to people invested in keeping it simple. The past no longer controls me, not because it was resolved, but because it was integrated. I don't deny what happened. I don't dwell there either. I carry the lessons forward, not the weight. Future freedom isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing differently. I choose relationships that can withstand honesty. I choose responsibilities that come with respect. I choose silence only when it serves peace, not when it serves fear. The key rests somewhere now, unremarkable, inert. It has no power on its own. It never did. Its power came from what it revealed, not what it unlocked. I used to think transformation required spectacle, a moment where everything exploded and reassembled into something new. What I know now is that transformation is quieter than that. It happens when you stop betraying yourself in small ways, when you listen to discomfort instead of explaining it away, when you honor your knowing without demanding proof. The story didn't end with a door closing. It began there. It began the moment I realized I could define my life without asking permission. The moment I understood that awareness is the first form of freedom. The moment I chose integrity over comfort and clarity over illusion. If you've been carrying a key you don't understand, I hope you know this. You're not obligated to hold anything that costs you yourself. You're allowed to ask what it opens. You're allowed to decide whether to use it at all. Some keys unlock rooms. Others unlock people. This one unlocked me. And once that happens, there's no going back to who you were before. Only forward with intention. Only forward with choice. Only forward, finally free.